Hello and welcome to Regenerative Rising's podcast, Elevating Stories, Activating Change. With me today is Finian Makepeace, Chief Strategy Officer of Kiss the Ground, and I am Nisha Mary Poulose, Executive Director of Regenerative Rising. Finian is a thought leader and a visionary who has led much of the effort in mainstreaming regenerative agriculture. He's one of the producers of the movie Kiss the Ground, which needs no introduction, and has been continuing to lead the movement that encourages agriculture to adopt whole systems approaches and embrace the interconnectedness of humanity and nature. Welcome, Finian. I'm very excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Great to connect, and of course, love all the work that you all have been doing right along with us the last many years in this movement to bring this idea to the world and get more people connected to it.
Wonderful. Yeah. We're excited for the next steps and all that's in the next phase of this movement as well. And you just attended the rally for resistance at Washington D.C. Last week, along with many other important voices in the movement, as well as farmers across scales, small scale farmers as well, of organic and regenerative agriculture. So how did it go?
It was great. The Rally for Resilience was really farmer centered, and specifically smallholder farmers, indigenous farmers, and generally BIPOC farmers and other disadvantaged farmers. But it was really calling attention to the need for, and generally the lack of support and prioritization that's happened at the USDA to help the smaller holder farmers and those that have been historically disadvantaged. It was quite an exciting rally. A couple of the Farmer Leadership Council members from Regenerate America, Kiss the Ground's campaign that we'll probably talk about in a minute for the Farm Bill, were able to speak there. Yadi Wang and Chili Yazi. Yadi is from Arizona. He's a first-generation farmer who is just doing incredible things in such a dry climate and proving their abilities. And then Chili Yazi is an indigenous farmer from New Mexico, and someone who's been in this fight and this work for such a long time. He introduced me to so many folks on the Hill the next day, but an incredible voice for this movement, and both of them spoke eloquently at that rally.
Wonderful. We do have a global audience listening in and to this podcast. And so before we dive in deeper, could you tell us a little bit more about what the Farm Bill is and what it means for the food system in the US and elsewhere in the world, and what exactly we're rallying for?
Great question. So around the world, several governments have different versions or incarnations of something similar. The Farm Bill here in the United States dictates much of our farm policy, meaning what are we incentivizing? What are we helping subsidize? Meaning, what is the tax dollars of the U.S. public going for in terms of agriculture? Are we helping the subsidization of mass conventional chemical-based highly degenerative agriculture, or are we starting to prioritize and push forward more regenerative ways of farming? And are we helping farmers do that with all the things that are accessible to them? So a lot of countries and territories have some type of governing structure to put forward support for farmers. And it really comes down to the voice of the chemical companies and some of these ag companies that are very much at the top, have been getting what they want largely, as well as the U.S. export market. But for the farmers, their situation around the world and in the United States continues to get harsher as the soil is degrading, as input costs are rising. Farmers are in a very tight situation. In the U.S., the average loss is 4% of what the debt is every year. That's the add-on that farmers are dealing with here. So in terms of the struggle, it is real. We're at dire case situation with the amount of desertification and loss of land. So this is a call to government to say we have to start prioritizing soil health and the ability for farmers to start advancing into regenerative agriculture.
Right. Yeah. So, the last century has really been about the chemical companies really driving this entire food system market and making it pro-chemical at every step of the agriculture process. And right now we're really, as you were saying, in many parts of the world, the whole idea is to how do we bring it back to native systems? How do we bring it back to earth-friendly or collaborative practices with the earth? And how do we use nature as a means to really be part of the food system? And what are some of the key things that really needs to change with the system itself? And one thing, of course, is the kind of the lobbying power that chemical companies have, but what else? And I ask you this because you have a very holistic approach to this problem, and you work at it at an individual and an organizational capacity. You enter the system from various sort of stress points, right? Like you're working at a legislature level, which is kind of putting pressure top down, but also bottom up. You have so much of a strong, deep relationship with farmers across the US, and also with just a kind of a worldwide audience of people, and mainstreaming the idea of regeneration. So what are these really critical things that we're looking at that needs to be specifically spoken of at this stage in the movement?
It's a great and big question, but I'll try to summarize it in a theory of change, which is pretty universal. I think it's not particularly niche to anyone, but almost always awareness is first, and then you have actions, and then you get the outcomes that you're hoping for. Our theory really revolves around there needs to and has to be constant support for the awareness, that invitation portal, or that area where people are able to grasp an idea and get deeper and more connected to it. Regenerative ag and soil health, while in many indigenous cultures has been a way of living around the globe and a way of being, predominantly in agriculture, as we've expanded out the models of chemical intensive agriculture, we've lost a lot of that. So the awareness of what's possible of regeneration, repair, rebuilding soil is really vacant. So we have to start with kind of where are we at in the human consciousness. Again, there are pockets of people in different groups who are doing it, have been doing it. Some, again, in indigenous cultures who are leading and have been leading in this. But the reality is most people are living under the guise of it is the way it is right now, whether they see a desert outside their home or this is the state of the soil or the ecosystem they're living in. And they're living, I would argue, mostly in a guise of sustainability. How are we going to conserve what little is left? How are we going to help farmers in this drought? How are we going to ease their pain by giving them alfalfa for their cows that are dying? People don't believe in regeneration. And until you start to shift that basic belief, you're left with people trying to compensate in a sustainable think. So that's where this awareness side, before we say actions, we have to say constantly paying attention to how far are we lifting up the awareness such that it hits critical mass and critical people who are decision makers. And that's where things like Kiss the Ground, the movie, and the assets that we've created that are short form content, the assets that we've created that are photographs, that the events like that you guys all have at Regen Rising, where your next event, I think, is in November. You've brought people who are leaders in food and ag and companies who are influential in their own right, but also demanding and creating demand for supply change. If they don't know the difference between sustainability and regeneration, nothing's going to change, because they can't find the source of their food and figure out if it's regenerating if they don't even understand what regeneration is. So we're dealing with a very big lack, kind of a separation of comprehension here. And we have to bring that together. Do people grasp? Do they understand? Do they have an empowered sense of being that regeneration is possible? And that's where I feel like, our two orgs have worked in different niches around this subject for quite some time. And it combines a lot of different methods. But overall, that awareness, Nisha, has to be front and center. Everyone can contribute to that. Everyone can pay attention to that. We're living in a current construct. Unless we change it to a regenerative thinking, regenerative future thought, we're going to be stuck in a little less bad and a conservation mentality.
Yeah,
That's where we start. So our storytelling in policy, in businesses, it comes back to, do people get it? Do they have this essential aha moment? And then you have to start not letting the money win, not letting it start to get slippery and greenwashed. And because it's easier, let's just keep doing it. That's where you have to play a bit more hardball and get people on your team and constantly show up, because inevitably easiness and money will make this concept diluted and fall on its face.
Yeah. That's a very beautiful way of phrasing it. And, I always, I'm really fascinated by the idea of timelines and how, the last couple of generations really think, and this is across the world, and we're really thinking in terms of 5 years or 10 years. And that's a sort of future that everybody is really taking the effort to envision. And then nature is like thinking in terms of thousands and if not millions and billions of years, right? And then, so whenever we also expect results in those kind of time. Anytime anybody's doing any kind of intervention, it's like months is about the maximum people are patient waiting. And then, okay, there are a few who may wait a few years. But the idea of regeneration, which is really kind of a natural concept, it's a part of nature. Everything in nature regenerates. And, essentially that's weaved into everything that is natural at a cellular level, at an ecosystemic level. And it's always fascinating to me about how do we flip this understanding of what it really means to be regenerative and go from this nexus of one problem creating multiple other problems, and then you're trying to solve each of those problems and then creating multiple other problems in the process, to this very inverting it into this natural system where there's so much balance and everything sort of solves each other and you don't really have a role in problem solving anymore.
Yeah, I think the thing I would extract from that is problems and solutions are compounding, and unintended or intended consequences have to be managed holistically. And if you don't, you are inevitably going to find failure. But I think one other point, and I'll just end on that part with, when it comes to regeneration, the compounding factors are really incredible, where you say, I did X and I did Y, shouldn't it all be good? And it might take a little bit of time, but then you do X, Y, and Z, and all of a sudden magic happens. Then you do X, Y, and Z, and then you start adding A, B, C, and all of a sudden nature's phenomenon. And now again, 500 million years of research and development should never be undervalued here. Nature has a law which makes sure that the efficiencies are always increasing. Efficiency is increasing for 500 million years, and knowing that the efficiencies require maximization of biodiversity, but are working towards maximization of energy capture and maximization of water capture, because life needs water and energy to operate, then you say, wait a minute, if we're not paying attention to those fundamental laws in our practices, we're going to be slow. So in the movie, I think Gabe Brown mentions, what takes him 1 year, because instead of doing 2 cover crop seeds, he's doing 17 different cover crop seeds. The inputs that those organisms, those plants are putting into the soil, the exudates, the chemical compounds that attract different biology, and what those biology then make available for the plant in a nutrition level and a chemical level, that is something that means compounding. You're compounding, but the more you add the diversity, all of a sudden, what would have taken application of different chemicals for 20 years, he's doing in one. So these are things where, yes, it can take a while, but thankfully, we are finally bringing in more of life's universal lessons of things like diversity matter, that when we're seeing, look, yes, like rotational grazing, right? That's what, 30, 40 years old as a big concept. We should rotate our animals, not just let them in one place for the entire year. Let's rotate them every month. And you're like, okay, what if you get that on steroids? What if you rotate them when you should, based on the grass being trampled a third, eaten a third left standing, and enough dung and urine scattered, and then you move them when you should based on that grass or when that grass is ready? and you have a cowboy or cowgirl out in the field doing it, all of a sudden your rate of regeneration is so fast compared to what is 30 years ago that, oh my gosh, we should do rotational grazing. That's what's so exciting for me right now. The advancements of regenerative agriculture are so phenomenal in terms of getting it, humans getting nature's capacity when we work with it, that it's super exciting. Like the quote I'll leave you with on that is Alan Williams, who says, what used to take us 15 to 20 years, we're now doing in 3 to 4. That is such an exciting premise. From what you said, the human condition is like, where are my results in 6 months to a year? Where are my financial results from 6 months to a year? That's all I'm looking at. Luckily, in most contexts, we're able to at least onboard farmers and ranchers when they get the right training and support to have those results, reducing their input costs by 30% in the first year or two. That's something that gives someone the confidence to keep going. And I think we're just lucky we've gotten to this stage in the movement that we're all pushing so hard, but we also have the experts and the practitioners out in the field able to do it and show it and give examples. So
yeah, absolutely. And it's also a little bit about really what does it look like to be efficient, and what does it look like to be productive, and the changing some of those definitions of how we perceive things, of what does abundance look like, or what does productivity look like?
Yes,
which is it's really also moving back into indigenous sort of worldviews of what it means when a season is acting a little bit differently from a previous season, and how do we embrace that and truly see abundance in it and like play off of that abundance.
I love that you said that. And I think in this realm that we're in, you have to simultaneously work in the jujitsu mind of like, you take what's coming at you and you return it with something, with an add-on. But, people are like, what are your yields? Oh, you got to keep your yields. Be like, okay, yeah, we can pretty much match the yields if we want to. But why aren't we talking about net profit here? If your input cost in general are more than your yield, who the heck cares about your yield? And this is some of the most amazing breakthroughs when you have farmers in the 70s who were pushed by the Secretary of Agriculture in this country to go big or go home and maximize every square inch of your field. All of those unintended consequences have compounded, where your soil's degraded, your watershed's depleted, your small water cycle's gone, your biodiversity's terminated. All of these things have happened, and you're left with what you're left with, and you're still trying to maximize. Now farmers are saying, wait a minute, I can actually pare down my operation, make more money here, help my local economy, while simultaneously having these major repairs, like your riparian areas, waterways, like the biodiversity hotspots that you're creating because you're working inside of your system, but you're benefiting financially because your input costs have gone down 40% in 2 years. So those are the kind of things that, speaking plain to farmer, of like, we're not going to try to get you to get that you're jumping from now to living like people who are native to this land somehow, like, oh, that's just going to, no, let's work with you practically here and start to see these gains. Like, wait, your great grandfather or your grandmother, remember their land? You can actually, now that you have pigs and you have cows and you have chickens and you have your agroforestry system and your row crops, you diversify and you have more of a portfolio. You're making more money. You're less vulnerable to input and output rises costs on the subsidy, on the commodity system. And all of a sudden you're resilient and you're a structure and a phenomenon in your community helping that economy. So it's just a constant, ever unfolding thing of like, we are so in the belief of yield at all costs. And it's such a BS thing that it's been farmers tricked into. So and the value of resilience, right? Like, not at the mercy of every little bit of change in climate or a little bit of change in weather. And I think at a well-being level, that is so much value, to have that confidence that the system that is part of what you've created is fitting into the natural system, and there's this ally kind of a relationship with nature that
and then you're resilient. And I was reading how with all of the flood that's been, the multiple floods that California is facing, that regenerative farmers are not suffering as much, and in fact are like finding value in the fact that they're bouncing back faster, they're not suffering as much damage.
That's such an important point, the resilience factor. I'll just leave folks with this image in your head. Imagine you are putting an inch of water onto a piece of land, half an inch of water even, just a minute, like that small amount. Most farms and ranches that are being tested in the United States right now infiltrate water at a half an inch per hour. Sit with that. That's almost as bad as like the cement outside your house. That water is going to evaporate very quickly or run off, carrying with it 4.6 tons of topsoil per acre per year. So you're creating a problem by breaking your soil and having it not work. Regenerative farms, if you counter that, so many of these farms able to infiltrate a half an inch of water in under 10 seconds, you have completely transformed your flood and drought issues. Now, I'm not saying that mega floods aren't going to still be mega problems for farmers, but as you mentioned, this bounce back for regenerative farms is super fast. They're still not broken and completely washed out. Now, the small amount of rain, a 2-inch rainfall, that should not be causing havoc on our farmland, but it is, because our farm soil is so depleted and degraded that it's causing all this havoc. Now, here's another kicker. Why are we working on things like the Farm Bill? The U.S. taxpayer pays up to 60% of the bill for crop insurance, which is what farmers use for if a weather or something else wrecks their crops, or if their yields are so low that they need a buff up for getting more county average help because of something out of their control. We're saying if the U.S. taxpayer is paying this, and this is something that exists in insurance, and all other insurance companies give incentives for what? Good drivers, right? Allstate, good drivers don't have to pay as much, because why? You're less risk prone. But we are now subsidizing easier the high risk farms compared to the low risk farms. So we're trying to say, at the very least, make it easier and more accessible for the extremely low risk farms than it is for the high risk farms. And that's just an insanity of our current system, one of many that we're trying to change with Regenerate America.
Yeah, very powerful thought, Finian. And while we sit with that, I just want to say that you are tuned in to Regenerative Rising's podcast, Elevating Stories, Activating Change. I am your host, Nisha Mary Poulose, Executive Director of Regenerative Rising. And with me today is Finian Makepeace, co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer of Kiss the Ground. And I want to just take a little bit of a slight tangent and talk of food systems as an ancient sort of a practice has always been a community effort. And the advent of machines and through the industrial era and then the chemical era have sort of brought this idea that you don't need other people because machines and chemicals are doing that work. But that was not the sole point of community in the food system, right? There was a lot of exchange of wisdom and sharing of practices, sharing of produce. And then there's the community aspect of bearing the shocks together, but also sharing the abundance. And, because Regenerate America and Rally for Resistance, it's all about community, about bringing people together and having that community voice. I really wonder, how do we usher the value of community back into the food system? And I mean, not that I'm expecting you to have the final answer, but what are your thoughts on that?
I definitely have some thoughts. It's a really great question, and thank you for bringing it. I don't think it's talked about enough, but we talk about indigenous place-based knowledge quite a lot. But when you're planting tomato seeds, right, and you are harvesting them and you're working inside of your own garden or your community garden, you're like, wow, this kale plant or these tomatoes did really well. I'm going to get the seeds from them and make sure next year, because the pace at which a plant can, your plant, different plants you have can actually be figured out of like what's working in this environment, in this context. Let's work with that one. Humans are very much the same. Obviously, we are just dead fast in this. You have to make sure indigenous place-based knowledge is making its way at least as credible as holistic management, and hopefully soon as credible as quote unquote scientific knowledge that's being utilized or seen as relevant in this regenerative ag conversations. But when it comes to community, one of the really sad things is just the ubiquitousness of just like the English language, for example. But what that does to where is authority coming from? So much of the authority is coming from top down and dispersed throughout the world to sell more stuff from the US and other countries like that. But we are losing not only in native languages, but native cultures and also trust in people who know things. I mean, from the age of getting rid of the witches, like we have just been decimating local-based knowledge holders such that other people have power, usually from outside dominating exterior colonizing forces. And you're like, what do we lose from that? And then we lose so much. What I'm trying to say is why there's hope is that we can start to pay attention to localized systems. And if we're not bought off and the coaches aren't certified crop advisors who make half their money selling you drugs from the chemical companies, if they're not your main coaches and you're actually having access to practitioners, farmers, or people who have learned from the land, I've seen, and I can, in my own lifetime, you have that wisdom starting to come back and we can start accessing it more. So it's not hopeless. We've decapitated it in most places around the world, unfortunately, but we can start to harness it and get it back, not just with indigenous technical place-based knowledge, but we can start to find that place-based knowledge of what's working in context. So it's really, really important. And I think we've just been trained so much to trust the people that we've been pointed to trust in my life, I'll just be plain about this, but as a white man who speaks pretty well in English most of the time, I have been able to be in spaces and present or share things. And I think it's my responsibility to do what I can to make sure other voices are being brought in, all this other stuff, because we're living in a sad, but the reality of the context, it's changing, it's shifting. There's a bunch of pushback from it changing right now from the powers that be, but we all have to start recognizing how much has been taken away from us because we've given away this authority to kind of the university system, the American English system, like so many businesses that are successful. It's just crazy. And that's why Monsanto and these other groups have so much power, because they say, oh, look, I'm going to get one person in this community to start being my salesperson. They're going to make a bunch of money and start driving their car around and saying, look, this is what you need to get rich. And 2 years later, you have, in India, like so many farmers committing suicide because they got bought and sold in this bullshit, pardon my language.
Yeah, and that's something that I know I care so deeply about. And I'm so glad that we're talking about it because, the food system is global. There is no way we can, literally everything we find on any shelf in any supermarket has touched the lives of millions, thousands across the world. And in its journey into the system, right? And also in its journey out. That's a very, very kind of a powerful way to look at it, that when we're changing the system, there's also the opportunity to use this globalized system to create global change and also really be conscious of the sort of power structures that exist, right? There's a formal power structure, which is like literally a world order that has been created. And then there's the informal power structure as well, when there's a white person in the room, how people react to it, and how through colonization, there's so much of sort of training that, okay, the white person knows best. And even if sometimes people do think they know, there's this need to stay silent. So I think it's a lot of consciousness to say, bring this up. And I think there's, there's so much more it's so much more powerful. It's so much more beautiful when there is power is so lonely to be. But the other way, we're all collaborating. If the whole world is like coming together to deviate from the idea of one truth, which is and look at place-based truths as well, place-based sciences, and that all of that will just enrich our entire system. And I'm just so glad that you spoke of that.
Yeah, and it's sometimes I don't know how much you know about it, but the origin for me of something we call soil advocate training. It's bizarre because I'm coming from a position of what people see as authority, and I'm constantly surprised at how few questions I get or pushback I get. I'm mostly self-taught in this work. Of course, I've been lucky to be connected with leading experts from all over the world. Like that's been a privilege of being as a media producer, people being able to be willing to talk with us and share all these insights. That's been really awesome. But surprisingly, through something like soil advocate training, where we've trained over 5,000 people from 30 different countries, there's a surprisingly little amount of, wait, what did you just tell me? Like, who are you to tell me this? And how does this make any sense? People taking it. Now that's okay, fine, whatever, let's take that off there. But more importantly than that, how are we having people move from listeners, people on the bleachers, to believing that there's someone on the court? And as much, I've designed the course to my best of my ability that is the purpose. How are we going to say, okay, there's people like me, there's people like you, Nisha, who are out there being like, I'm a part of this, I'm going to contribute, I'm going to be a part of moving this forward. So many people are still on the bleachers. And part of that is our education system, of how it's been top down and how people think of themselves. Some of it's just personality type, but even making a course that's designed to bring people onto the court to be players in the regenerative agriculture movement, we're still really, at the end of the day, probably looking at 15, maybe 20% of those graduates who are really taking that leap. And of course, there's so many other reasons and rationale that can go along with it, but we're still dealing with this kind of a mentality. And I was homeschooled growing up, so I didn't really have a lot of just conventional education. Like, you just listen and you regurgitate what the person tells you to regurgitate. But we're definitely in a problem now. And so our soil advocate training, I think, is a tool that provides people the means to go from, I heard about this idea, I think it's cool, I love it, to I am now being given the access to the resources, but also empowered technically to be a deliverer of this, to be a person who's actively doing this. And that is what it takes. You can't have, in my view, you can't have people constantly taking leadership from top down. If you empower them to be their own leaders, then all of a sudden you have, and I hear occasionally like, oh, this thing's doing this thing's doing this. We're not like constantly like, okay, here's your next move, advocates. That's not how it works. This is, how are you, being a Finn or a Nisha? That's the game plan of this advocate training program. So that's something that I think that allows people to see themselves and say, I've gotten some of the basics, I've gotten some of the science, I can articulate this more. And now I feel more empowered to take myself into this work. So pushing the system forward, like progressing, moving that needle from different directions so that there's different types of information coming into it. I just attended Expo West, and it's interesting that it was happening at the same time as the Rally for Resistance in Washington D.C. And for me, this was my first Expo West, and I really saw that it was really beautiful, the kind of passion that people have towards really finding ways to work into the system. And this transition is really about changing your mindset. It's changing your ways of living. It's changing the way you see nature, and the way you change how you value life. There's so much going on, and there's so many advancements of science, new practices, best practices coming from different parts of the world. And there's, of course, the leaning into ancient and indigenous knowledge. And it's really just, I felt honored to be in the presence of so much conversation, so much genuine intent amidst a very capitalistic system that we're still working out of.
I'm curious to ask you, what do you see as the sort of the next conversation we need to have to keep this movement and community sort of like to think more, to expand this consciousness?
That's a great question. I think I mentioned before another law that I don't know if it's technically a law, but money and laziness or ease are constantly what we're going to have to be combating, and comfort of what people have. So change is hard for anyone. The farmers who are doing the change is hard for them, because whether or not the chemical companies hijacked their father or mother 20, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, or whatever, they're still accustomed to a traditional thing and a way of how it goes that you're up against. And that goes for everything and everybody. And that's where change is always, I think, incremental in some ways. But this is where right now, I'll give you an example of what we're fighting right now. So we're looking at the Farm Bill, and we just today got information that there are certain allies out there who are kind of just being like, this is a good idea. We need more certified, we need more technical service providers. These are people who help farmers to start implementing practices, right? And there's something called certified crop advisors. So you say, wait, we have all these certified crop advisors. Why don't we just make them technical service providers so they can start implementing the government's programs? Well, here's the catch. As I mentioned before, that group that I mentioned a minute ago, over half their income, the certified crop advisors, comes from selling inputs, fertilizers and pesticides, herbicides, fungicides. So if you're just going to say, oh, we need more of these people helping farmers get this stuff, and you're saying, let's just certify all these huge group of whatever, 15,000 plus around the country. No, wait a minute. That's obviously easy to do and fast, but that is not solving the problem. These people don't know the basic tenets of soil health and how to prescribe and help with that. And they're still chemical salespeople. So those two things married together, you're all of a sudden you're saying, oh yeah, this works because Bayer says, yeah, that's totally makes sense for our push for soil health and regenerative ag. Oh, really? Well, simultaneously, it helps you sell a boatload of product. So these are the kind of things that, as we're moving into this space and things seem logical, we have to think holistically. We have to think about unintended consequences. And we have to be willing to rear our heads and say, hey, look, this train's moving, but I got to call a spade here. And there are people doing this for the inclusion of different cultures, BIPOC people. There are people doing this for chemical stuff. There are people doing it. And it's not easy to be the messenger, but it is absolutely important. So you're like, oh, great. Our board member, Natalie, was just calling out Nestle of like, yeah, great. Good on ya for pushing this message. But what is your current reality and what are you doing about it? Like we can play nice, but play hard. And that's what we have to do is people can't just get off easy with the usual, and we have to dig deeper. I mean, I think it's just sad that we're retracting back in so many parts of our culture to like, this has gone too far. People are trying to make it too good for everyone. Be like, at the end of the day, you got to be faced with like, what if your family, or what if your sons and daughters were X, or what if you were in this position? What would it be like for you? We kind of tend to just put it out there like, oh, this is uncomfortable for me to think about. So, or to do anything about. So let's just pretend it's not something we should deal with. But progress isn't easy. It's stretching always.
It's a great time to really bring up some audacity to the conversation and ask some things that make people uncomfortable. And there's something that I was discussing.
I think, just a note, I think you can do it in a loving and constructive way. I personally have found so much more pace and big changes when I'm doing it with a smile on my face, with a commitment to help. But just doing the call out thing, it does ring, it tires a lot of people out, and it doesn't feel like you're on their team. So I used to be the rally leader, the sign holder, the drum beater around the marches. It wasn't until I was in LA and there were thousands of us outside of City Hall, and one of the council members came out and said, look, thank you for being here. Our doors are open. We're understaffed and overworked. If you have ideas, bring them in. Come into the building. And I took the person at their literal command, and a week later, went in, figured out what's happening with the compost policy, brought a group together, changed language, and a month later, we completely changed the RFP that was going out to change the entire waste haul system for Los Angeles. But what I would have been just beating a drum outside. That's great. We still have to do that. But we also have to be like, if you have the idea, who the heck do you think is going to write the idea? If you don't write it, someone else with ulterior motives, probably just financial and other, are going to get the seat at the table because they're showing up, they're going into the office, they're making relationships with those staffers who are writing those bills. They're going to get written. Are you there? Mm-hmm. And you can't just show up for the 1-minute comment period that they offer the public. You got to go in the doors.
Yeah, it brings us back to what we started off this conversation with, about how you're empowered to be part of the change, to really have the hope that you can also contribute to the system with ideas, with actions, with impact, and not just to like comment in the end or stay helpless at the sidelines. I'm conscious of the time, and I before we end, I want to ask you, what's new for Kiss the Ground? Is there anything you want to share?
All right, yeah, Kiss the Ground is excited to announce we brought in a new CEO back in August. We're about 10 years in right now. Kiss the Ground, the movie, brought so much attention to the work we're doing as champions for regenerative ag movement. We have a lot of media coming out this year and the following years. It's short form for educational purposes. We have a great film that we collaborated on with a woman named Lila June. It's called Possibilities of Regeneration. It's an animated short form movie that's really designed to highlight what's kind of been left out of the story a lot of times, which is the indigenous knowledge and actual agricultural systems of the United States. That's now the United States. That's a piece that's coming out this April. And then we have a bunch of short form content coming out. But a lot of people are probably wondering, the next film, Common Ground, is coming out. It's the follow-up film to Kiss the Ground. We're so excited about it. It's going to be a big thing, bigger than Kiss the Ground was in terms of its availability and other means. And it definitely shares more of the voices. Still not 100% inclusive of everybody. That's almost impossible when you're making content in any stretch, but it definitely does, I think, a better job than the previous film on including more voices in this movement. And then on advocacy, Regenerate America has been front and center. We're carrying that through till the Farm Bill is signed, sealed, delivered. That's going to be at the end of this year. So we're still looking for folks who want to get involved, support that, businesses that want to get involved, farm groups that want to get involved, people who want to sign the petition. So we're trying to get to 100,000 signatures to deliver really soon. So please go to regenerateamerica.com to do that. And then our education, we are expanding where and how we're reaching massive audiences with this education opportunities. I mentioned soil advocate training. This is a place where people can really access their leap into this movement and take a big leap forward and empower themselves with slides, with training on all these different parts of the movement. And so those are the three areas: media creation, education, and advocacy that we're really 3Xing in the next 3 years.
Perfect. Yeah. As it's really looking at the same problem and how to include more people in and working at the system from very, very many sides at the same time, so that the change that is affected is really wholesome. And the last thing I want to ask you is, the Regenerative Earth Summit is back this year from our end.
Yes.
It's been something that you've been a big part of, and I just wanted to ask you for some.
Yeah, for folks listening, I'm not just saying this to give a shout out here, but there are parts in this movement that are absolutely essential. And I think people who look at where they can be of best value is really critical. Some people are like, oh, I just want to get into this area because that makes sense. But I implore people to look, where can you help? And sometimes we're not the experts, but the work that you did at Regenerative Rising with Regenerative Earth Summit, has brought forward so many key partnerships, so many key relationships that now are expanding. You know, I work with Gina from Applegate all the time. I met her as, oh my gosh, that's Gina from Applegate, whatever, 7 years ago. But now we're really good friends and we work on so many things in this movement together. But there's countless examples of what a very intentional, well set up conference that's very much at the heart of what regenerative ag and this movement is about. So I encourage folks to go to that. I think it's invaluable when we're connecting with like minds, but it empowers the movement to be amongst folks who are in and to see the diverse players in the mix and be able to see them as peers and as colleagues in this big journey together.
Thank you for that. That's a really wonderful thought to share. And I'm glad to really see the power of these summits and what it means when we come together as a community and as a collective. And I think, with that, we're almost at the top of the hour. And thank you so much, Finian, for sharing your wisdom, your experiences, and your very deep, true understanding of the system and what it means to be regenerative and how to be positive and inclusive as we take steps towards the transition that awaits us.
Indeed. Thank you so much for having me and having this podcast and all the work that you all are doing. Looking forward to working with you in the future more and more. But everyone out there, this is your signal. If you're not already involved, get involved. These two organizations, Regeneration Rising and Kiss the Ground, are both pathways to deepen your involvement in this critical movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Finian. This is Regenerative Rising's podcast, Elevating Stories, Activating Change. I am your host, Nisha Mary Poulose, and the Executive Director of Regenerative Rising. And with me today is Finian Makepeace, co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer of Kiss the Ground.